Hey there, and welcome to your lecture video on topic 2.1, which is Introduction to Biodiversity. I'm going to run through the questions and kind of show you where things are in the book, make a few commentaries on them. This does not keep you from having to be able to read the material, but it will also kind of help you find what you need to find. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. This particular section is pretty heavy on vocabulary in terms of just knowing what words are, but then also it has you comparing and contrasting a lot of things just so you kind of understand the boundaries of what we're talking about. Please keep in mind that when we define a category of something, like we're going to be talking about the difference between core habitats and edge habitats, these are all human constructs, and we're painting in broad strokes. Not everything falls into the same, not everything falls into a category. It's oftentimes a continuum. We do mostly talk about things that are all or nothing as examples, but do realize not everything will fall neatly into those categories. All right, so the first question that you have wants you to define biodiversity, which is absolutely right here in the very first section of what you should have been reading on page 94. The next question, which is talking about functional diversity, ecological diversity, genetic diversity, and species diversity, is all right here in this graphic. I really like looking at pictures in addition to, or sometimes instead of the text, because it really allows you to chunk all of these things into one block of information in your head. So here, excuse me, this is going to be loud. All right, so functional diversity is basically all of the biogeochemical cycles and whatnot that we talked about already. So these three things are new here, and they kind of are like Russian nesting dolls. Genetic diversity, you see within just a species or a population, so just one organism or one group of the same organism. Then here, species diversity is where you're talking about all of the different species in an area, and then here you're basically talking about the variety that's going on the entire globe. So your next question wants you to differentiate between species richness and species evenness. This is a topic that does come up in multiple different ways. So definitions are right here. Richness is the number of different species in ecosystems. Evenness is comparative abundance. So this is where you do a count. So as you read this, the next question does talk about, in general, how these two concepts are linked. Basically, high species richness and high species evenness goes together, where low species richness and low species evenness also goes together. When you have more species and you have more equal numbers of those same species, especially when you're talking about things that have a similar ecological niche, like types of trees as an example in a forest, it protects you from outside threats in a variety of ways that we're going to discuss in this class. All right, next question, describe the change in species diversity as one moves from the equator to the poles. The equator is where you're going to have the richest diversity, and then as you move to colder areas, your diversity is going to go down in terms of number of species. Let's see, what is the link between genetic diversity and species survival? This question is basically setting you up for our discussion on evolution, and what's going on there is that the more genetic variation that you have, the more pre-adaptations you've got in the event of something changing in your environment. So that means at least a portion of your population will survive a change moving forward. And that is a key thing to get into your head, is that change does not happen in response to an event. That change has to, that adaptation that allows for a portion of the population to survive already has to exist before the event takes place, or else the whole population dies. I mean, see dinosaurs as an example. All right. You should already understand everything regarding ecosystem diversity. So yeah, especially in terms of biomes, that's where all of that's coming from. All right, so we're on question 7, differentiate between core habitats and edge habitats. That is something that we have talked about already. In the core is where you have conditions that are very constant and don't change. They're the ultimate characteristics of that biome. Of course, this is without things like climate change and whatnot, but stuff stays the same. And then when you get to an edge and you have two different biomes that are butted up against each other, that's where you have that change. Remember that ecotone as you go from one biome to the other. Lots of stuff going on there. So that's where you have the highest amount of competition. Now, what you should be able to start being able to do is to make some conclusions. In class, we have already discussed, hopefully, generalists and specialists. You have to think that specialists probably live in the core of an ecosystem where things aren't changing, while generalists do just fine out here in the edges where they've got different stuff going on. So you should be able to make those connections. Let's see, how does human-caused habitat fragmentation affect the amount of core habitat and edge habitat present? So let me go grab a pen, hold on a second. So when you have a single habitat like this, you have a lot of core and not a lot of edge. But then when you fragment this, your edge amount continues to grow where your core amount begins to shrink. So again, this is a situation where generalists would end up surviving and specialists not so much. So this becomes important when we start talking about human populations and human developments and how it impacts large ecosystems that are unbroken by human activity up until we come and start doing our thing. Ecotone, again, is something I believe that we've talked about already. Definition is right here. It's that transitional zone between one habitat and the next. How is biological diversity linked to ecosystem stability? Again, the more diversity you have, the more stable you're going to be, because if one species goes extinct for whatever reason or something changes, you've got plenty of other stuff that is going to survive the loss of that species or that particular change. All right, let's see what else. Who is E.O. Wilson? I believe that we've talked about that plenty already. He's our dude right here. He's considered to be the greatest living biologist. He is the one who has talked about when an animal is brightly colored, it's probably toxic in some way, and if it's brightly colored and slow moving so you can pick it up, it's probably going to kill you. So he has a lot of little sayings like that that can kind of help you remember different key points as we move through the class. Differentiate between an ecological niche and a habitat. A niche is something's job, and a habitat is its home. So if you look at this particular picture here, the habitat is the intertidal zone of this marine ecosystem. However, you can see each one has a different niche. This one, this flamingo dabbles on the bottom of the sandy bottom. This one goes after worms right here at the edge. This one skims along the top of the ocean. Again, this is resource partitioning that allows all these different birds to survive. Whenever you see an animal in the wild, despite there being lots of other different organisms around it in the same place, the fact that they all exist means that they all have a part of a niche that they can use. Now, take one of these organisms out, and this is something that, let me see if this is coming. No, but again, this is something for you to know. That's when, let's say some of these birds are taken out here. That's when a realized niche will grow larger, more towards its fundamental niche, where it can consume more of the resources here. So again, try to start layering all of these different things into your brain. Be able to put all of these things together into a larger whole. Generalist and specialist. Generalist is something that has a broad niche breadth. It can exist in a lot of different areas. Specialist is very specific. Specialists do really well when things stay the same. Generalists do really well when things are constantly changing. There's a reason why raccoons have no problem going dumpster diving in human environments, because they are a generalist and they have no problem finding the kind of garbage that they can eat to go ahead and survive in an urban environment. Differentiate between native species and non-native species. Native species, again, you find in an area for hundreds and hundreds of years, and non-native species are ones that have found their way, usually through human influence, into an area. And one of the interesting things to think about is when does an exotic species become established and then becomes a native species? It's, again, a human construct. Pretty much everything is from somewhere else. And, it can be non-native this century, and then next century, when it's been around for a couple hundred years, then we go ahead and call it native because it's here to stay and it's reshaped the ecosystem and the food web so that it is now a part of it. And we talked about in class the difference between non-native and invasive. All right, let me see what page numbers I need to be dealing with here. So we went from 94 to 96, 98 and 99. We need to also go to, let me see where the white-tailed deer are, 194 and 195. Ah, here they are. Our little friends, the white-tailed deer, right here. We will talk about our selected and case-selected species a little bit later on, but for right now, just kind of focus on the fact that white-tailed deer, although they are a native species, have become invasive because humans have killed their predator, and then also humans have moved into what has traditionally been their habitat on their own. So let's see. Again, invasive species are those that have kind of taken over an ecosystem, specifically from a food web perspective. They have a tendency to kind of do their thing unchecked. These are organisms that have reached the fullest potential of their fundamental niche. So let's see. How can invasive species end up in their new environment? They can be deliberately introduced, or they can be accidentally introduced if they are exotic. And then if they are native, they can again, have all of their natural checks and balances removed. So again, that their realized niche grows to meet their fundamental niche. Identify several deliberately introduced and accidentally introduced species. You definitely, this is one of those things that can appear on the national exam in terms of, oh hey, here is here's a question, name one invasive species. So definitely commit those to memory. So 194 and 195, this all talks about the deer. So I believe I need to go to 243 through 246. I'm not doing it right now, but in coming lectures, I can show you how to annotate your book. And to annotate means to kind of add little bits of information to go ahead and have notes in your book without actually writing in your book. So 243 to 246, hopefully these are the, yeah, okay. So these are the right pages here. Where did Kudzu originate? This is all talking about beneficial and harmful non-native species. There's a little bit on habitat fragmentation there. This little piece right here on HIPCO is something that we will be discussing a little bit later on. That is a acronym that you will eventually need to memorize. So here is a list of deliberately introduced species and accidentally introduced species. What you're going to see time and time again is that people will introduce things for what they consider to be their best interest, and then lo and behold are surprised when things don't go the way that they think that they should. An example that's not in the book that I love referencing is the European starling. I will at some point in class point it out to you. It is a bird that flocks in the thousands and can land on a grain field and just denude it very quickly, eat a lot of what's there. The reason that they are in the United States, they are European, is that there was a man in New York who decided that every animal that was mentioned in Shakespeare's collected works should exist in the United States. And so he released some breeding pairs that established themselves very quickly here in the United States. The Muscovy duck here in the state of Florida was introduced for hunting purposes, and they have definitely outcompeted a lot of our native ducks for areas, nesting areas, and for just habitat in general. Kudzu is something that if you've ever traveled around the South, you're familiar with. This stuff can grow like feet a day. It's kind of ridiculous. Some of you guys, when you're doing your eco columns, have commented on how quickly your bean plants grow. Yeah, this is a similar situation. So, where did kudzu originate? It's Japanese. Why was it introduced here? Through overuse of soil resources, we are starting to have a lot of uncovered soil that when it rained would wash away. So the fertility of the soil, the nitrates and the phosphates ended up in the water, and then you end up with landfills and, bad. So, hey, this stuff grows fast. We'll go ahead and plant it, and then it will keep the soil in place. Sure. The problem is there are no checks and balances, so this stuff literally, people can go on vacation for a couple of weeks, and kudzu can come back and completely cover their car. It grows that quickly. Where was it introduced? It was the southern United States. You don't need to be more specific than that. So if you have to pick a state, Georgia's always really good to start with. Several negative impacts of kudzu in its new environment. Definitely read through this. It's right in here. It grows so rapidly that it engulfs hillsides, gardens, trees, stream banks, and cars. It will also grow over trees and literally kill them because they can't perform photosynthesis anymore. So it basically makes it so it's the only thing that's growing in a particular area. You can dig it up, burn it, and it will continue to spread. You have to pull everything out, including the roots. Very difficult to kill. You use too much herbicide on it, and some of it will wash into your drinking water. Now, they've found a common fungus that can kill it, but then the problem becomes if you introduce it into the environment, is it going to impact everything else that's there? Who knows? Excuse me for a second. Thank you. All right. How do we control it? Again, it's talking about the Japanese bug that controls it in Japan. But again, who's to say that if you introduce it, that it's going to go after the kudzu and not something else? It's that whole idea of you're bringing in another invasive species to control the first invasive species. Yeah, it doesn't sound like a good plan. The only way to get rid of this stuff is basically through repeated manual pulling out of this stuff. The basic manual labor is the only way that I've heard that you can really make a dent in this stuff. Possible way to control... How do accidentally introduced organisms find their way to their new environment? This is something that has appeared multiple times on the national exam. You need to be able to guess, even if you don't know how these things got from one place to the next. For an example, zebra mussel. It is all over the Great Lakes. I'll probably talk about it in class. How does it get from lake to lake when they're not connected? So you have to think to yourself, people recreationally boat. These things get caught, they're on the bottom of a boat, and then we go to the next boat, they release, and then there they are. Also, and this is something we'll talk about when we talk about humans and how they use the oceans, ships take in water to lower themselves in the water so that they're more stable when they travel. So if you've got zebra mussels and baby zebra mussels in one place, and these are Russian, and then you have a trip across the ocean, and then you release it in a new place, zebra mussels basically hitched a ride on a boat. Pythons, contrary to popular belief, were not introduced because people had them as pets and they got too large and released them, although that is how some people do release them. We're fairly certain that during Hurricane Andrew, which is one of the very first recorded Cat 5s we had here in terms of hurricanes in modern history, it basically broke open every exotic pet shop in the Miami Homestead area, and all those little guys just went slithering out into the Everglades. These things, like the red fire ant, is from Argentina, hitched a ride in the 30s and 40s on some wood that was not inspected before it came to the United States. Hey guys, fire ants weren't a thing before the 30s and 40s. So be able to make some educated guesses if you see this stuff on the national exam. You don't have to memorize all of them, but you just have to be able to use your common sense. What is the global capital for invasive species? Ladies and gentlemen, you live in it. The state of Florida is the global capital for invasive species. We have more than anybody else, so go us, I guess. What region of the world do Burmese pythons come from? I really want for you to look that up. You can't just you can't say Asia. Be able to point on a map to where that thing comes from. How does a Burmese python impact its new environment? Holy Hannah, this thing eats everything the size of a 140-pound deer or smaller. There's next to nothing smaller than a deer in the Everglades anymore. And it is one of the reasons why these animals are starting to leave the Everglades and starting to come out into suburban areas to look for food. We're starting to see more and more examples of dogs that are left outside overnight that are being killed and consumed by pythons in Miami, as an example. Pythons have been caught here in Lee County. They've been caught in Marco Island. They've been caught in Collier County as well. Sorry, the here in Lee County part, that's where I live. But also they've been caught in Collier County, so they've definitely spread out from the Everglades. And as our planet gets warmer, they are starting to go farther and farther north. Let's see, what makes the python resilient in its efforts to control it? Your book talks about how, and again, they have the huge appetites. At this point, we're not going to get rid of them. We just have to figure out a way to control them. They're hard to find, they're hard to capture, and they reproduce rapidly. So basically, here's what happens. You can walk right by one, and you're not going to see it. Its coloring, although it looks striking to us, it's what's called cryptic. It means that it can hide in plain sight, and you can walk by one and never see it. Despite their size, they're very quick. You can also see they're very muscular, and they're very tough to capture. They also lay a ton of eggs. And another thing that they do is the females sit and incubate them by shivering on them until they hatch. So there's also a bit more parental care than in terms of keeping the eggs alive until they can hatch than you may be used to in a snake. Let's see. And a side note, this is an important thing here. Roughly only 1 out of every 100 species that invade an area is able to establish a self-sustaining population. So just because something comes to an area, it doesn't mean it's going to establish itself. It's a lot like taking an emperor penguin and dropping it off on the beaches. On Barefoot Beach, it's not going to make it, even if it's in a breeding colony. But if you bring something over where the new environment is a lot like its old environment, if you look at where the Burmese python is from, and then you take your finger and run it and keep it where it is, and then you turn, if you're on a globe, and then just turn the globe so you're not moving your finger, you're going to see that Florida is in the same latitude, lat long as the where the Burmese python is from. It's used to this weather, it's used to this environment, it just doesn't have its predators here and other control methods that it does where it's from. Outside of scientific research, list 3 ways to prevent species from becoming introduced to new habitats in which they become invasive. I don't mean this. Individually doing things is great, but there are other things that can be done. So besides researching, that's nothing that we can control as individuals. Another strategy is to establish treaties with other countries to ban the import of identified species and then also inspect incoming cargo. So as an example, things like the fire ant aren't coming in anymore because we're starting to inspect cargo. And then the state of Florida no longer allows pythons, I believe Burmese pythons, to be sold as pets. I'm still kind of fuzzy on the legislation. It kind of goes back and forth. And then also not allowing them to be, even their parts, to be bought and sold, because then people will capture them so they grow larger and then they end up escaping. So this idea of having treaties with other places to say, you know what, your stuff stays there, our stuff stays here, and we'll go ahead and leave it that way. And then individually, don't buy this stuff. I know we see a cute animal or something that we're really drawn to. We're like, oh, I want to own that. Don't. Go visit it in a zoo. Go support it in its native environment. but resist that human urge to own it yourself, because moving an animal from one place to the next is either going to impact that animal because it doesn't live in its normal environment, or if something happens, it gets out, it's going to impact its new environment. So we need to be a part of our environment as opposed to trying to exert complete control over our environment and shifting it around as we see fit, because there are always unintended consequences for that. All right, so that's pretty much the end of this. This is, like I said, just kind of an intro lecture. I will go more into the questions as they become more complicated, but this just kind of shows you where to find things in your textbook. So these lectures don't take the place of the reading, but they should enhance your reading in terms of being able to find things. So have a great day.